So, good afternoon or good evening, wherever you happen to be watching from, and happy Veterans Day, or again, wherever you happen to be watching from, happy Remembrance Day. Today is November 11th, so a lot of people around the world are remembering the veterans in their life and also commemorating the armistice that brought an end to the First World War. So with the First World War, recently, if you've been watching the channel, you've noticed that we've been pretty content heavy with the Great War. Did a little bit around the Ypres salient and Notre Dame de Lorette, but our primary focus has been on the Battle of Arras, which includes the Battle of Vimy Ridge. And in preparation for that series, honestly, one of the catalysts for me wanting to go to Arras was a podcast called The Old Front Line, which is run by military historian Paul Reed. Paul Reed is also the author of several books, including this one, Walking Arras, and was extremely helpful to me, both personally and through the work that he does in visiting that battlefield and prepping for it. So I thought that today on Veterans Day or Remembrance Day, on the anniversary of the end of the First World War, well, it would be appropriate to maybe sit down and have a chat with Paul. So I'm going to bring him in now.
Paul, good evening.
Yes. Good afternoon.
Hi, JD.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me on this.
No, man, I appreciate you taking the time. For those of you who are watching, what you don't know is this was all put together like within the past 24 hours. I sent Paul a message and I said, "Hey, I just had an idea. Would you be willing to come on the channel tomorrow?" So this is all just pretty spontaneous. So anyway, I appreciate you jumping on here on such short notice.
My pleasure. I mean, you know, the best things happen quickly, and who knows what we'll talk about.
Well, that is the most accurate statement all day, because I have no clue. We're just going to kind of jump on and chat about anything First World War. So if anybody has any questions as we go along, we're talking to a guy who my friends and I have given him the name the Godfather of World War I history is what we've started calling him.
Oh gosh. Well, I realize I've been around a long time now, you see, so it's probably dinosaur maybe is fair description. But yeah, I mean, obviously I've been interested in this all of my life, one way or another. But visiting these battlefields is a 40-odd year kind of journey for me, from being a school kid who finally had a chance to go on a school trip to Ypres to see Flanders and kind of understand that, and then kind of went from there. But it you know, I mean, I grew up in the 70s where in Britain, all of our comics was kind of full of war stuff, and the movies were all war related, and we played with, you know, model soldiers and made plastic kits, and at school we refought the battles of 2 world wars in the playground and all that kind of stuff, you know. And we went up into I mean, I lived on what we call a council estate, but right next to a big forest, and we'd go up there and we'd dig foxholes and make guns out of sticks and things like this, you know. So it was kind of always there. So it went from being this kind of childhood fascination like that to going to Ypres, and I'm sure possibly that you kind of maybe had the same feeling when you first went there, that journey, that first time journey as a teenager, for me completely changed me, I think, and it took me on that path that would kind of take me along the old front line, you know, for probably the rest of my life, however long that may well be. But you know, it's a fascinating journey, it's a never-ending journey, and it's an eternal journey of discovery, really, because no one knows it all, far from it. And the great pleasure of it is that you genuinely find new things all the time. You know, as soon as you scratch the surface of any part of that battlefield, then you'll find something new and some new perspective on it, really, and which is great.
Yeah, your childhood sounds similar to mine. I can remember I don't know if they had them in Britain or not, the little plastic green army men.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Airfix figures, we called them. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I
Yeah.
had like divisions upon divisions of those things, and played with those when I was younger. And then if you were to go to my grandma's house today, which is, she lives on a farm. If you were to go out back, it would probably look like you were visiting an old battlefield with all of the foxholes that are back there in the woods that my brother and I dug, playing army and all kinds of things like that. And then I was big into like the GI Joes and everything.
Yeah.
Tell me about that first trip that you took to the front.
Well, I mean, at that kind of time, so this is like 1982. There was I was 15 years old, and there was a comic strip at that time called Charlie's War, which was about a young teenage Tommy in the trenches of the First World War, which I was avidly kind of reading. And the school did this trip over to Ypres, and I think when we kind of drove into the area, I kind of expected to see trenches still everywhere. We did go to see some preserved trenches, the Trench Museum at Sanctuary Wood. There was another one in those days at a place called Krunart Wood, which is a slightly different kind of prospect now. It's called Bayernwald Bavarian Wood, and it is a place where Hitler fought during the First World War. I think you've done a video on it, haven't you?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. We had a
yeah.
video there.
Yeah, and we went to places like that. But what kind of amazed me was just how much there was in the fields really then. And we walked across this field at a place called the Bluff near Ypres. And one of the kids, this is kind of health and safety gone mad. One of the kids picked up something in a field, I think thinking it was a Coke can, and threw it at the teacher and said, "What's that, sir?" And it was the top half of a German stick grenade. This thing, I remember seeing this thing kind of catapult through the air and land at the foot of our history teacher. It wasn't best amused, really, but I think what struck me most of all in the cemeteries was this individualistic commemoration with these headstones with inscriptions on them, and these weren't just kind of abstract names from the past. They were real people, and some of them were the same age as me. We went to Valentine Strudwick's grave, and when I first stood at that, I was the same age as him. So he's 15 years old when he was killed in 1916.
Oh my
one
gosh.
short of his 16th birthday. But I realised, I think, that there was quite a lot to discover, and one of my history teachers was really big on oral history, actually speaking to people who were there. And he put me in touch with a couple of First World War veterans who lived in my town. And I went along, kind of not really knowing what I was doing to start off with. But that, again, kind of took me on a path. And over the next 10, 12 years, I interviewed over 350 of these guys.
Oh my gosh.
And I lived in a part of Britain in the south, which was a big kind of retirement area where people, it's slightly better weather than up in the grim north. And having lived in the grim north, I can say that. But it's slightly better weather. So a lot of these old boys, they came from all over Britain to kind of retire there.
Huh.
And they lived in retirement homes. And I even used to kind of put adverts in newspapers, you know, "Are you a First World War veteran?" And a great help was Martin Middlebrook's First Day of the Somme book,
Okay.
which had come out long before I got interested. But in the back of it, and I got to know Martin, and he couldn't really explain why he did this. He listed all the veterans that he interviewed and what regiments they were in, and then for some reason put where they were living at the time that he interviewed them. So I got the phone books out of the library and looked these guys up, and I'd ring them up and I'd say, you know, are you Mr. Brown, who served with the Middlesex Regiment in Mash Valley on the First Day of the Somme? And he'd say, I am. And we'd
Wow.
chat, and it was kind of a telephone conversation, consultation almost, really, as to kind of whether it was worth to go around and see them. And some, not all of them wanted to talk, but with a bit of cajoling, I'd normally get a kind of a chance to go around and see them. And then some were in a position, for all sorts of reasons, to remember more than others. I mean, a lot of these guys had buried this stuff pretty deep, and didn't want to dig it up again. And but others had got to a point in their life, I think, when I look back on it, and I've seen a similar thing with Second World War veterans, as you may have done.
Yeah.
is they kind of get to a point where they become confessional, and they want to tell you their story. They've kept it locked deep inside for all that time, and they want to tell you. And I went along and pressed the right buttons, spoke some of the right language, got them to trust me, and they told me things. And I kind of, at the time, I don't think I realized how extraordinary this was actually at the time. But when I look back on it and the kind of conversations I had with these guys about everything from, what it was like to be in the trenches, to military discipline, had they seen men who'd been executed, for example. And as I got a bit older and a bit cheekier, I'd even ask them about mademoiselles from Armentières, what it was like being behind the lines, and did you come across any attractive French girls? And then they'd kind of talk about that kind of thing as well, which was, again, quite an extraordinary thing. And some of these guys, I mean, one guy I went to see, my mum had actually met him in a hospital. She'd gone for a routine hospital appointment, and he was in there, and she got his details for me, and I went to see him. And his name was Mr. Wheeler, and he was with the Royal Sussex Regiment on the Somme. And he'd been really badly wounded, blown up onto the German wire by a shell blast, and then hung on the wire for several days until the stretcher bearers got him in.
Oh my gosh.
And it had blown a whole chunk out of the front of his face, and he ended up having plastic surgery to rebuild it, but also was given a China faceplate to wear. So it was a painted mask basically that he had to wear to cover up his scars.
Wow.
And when I interviewed him when he was in his 80s, those scars had gone kind of very silvery and didn't look as bad as they'd once done. But he had this thing in a drawer, and it was the most extraordinary thing that I'd ever seen. I'd seen photographs of them, but never an original. And he had a very good story to tell, but he didn't live much longer because he was very unwell, and he died about 6 months later. And I rang his daughter up, trying to persuade her to donate it to the Imperial War Museum, because I don't think that they had one. It's this kind of thing that should have been preserved. But she said no. She said, I've smashed it with a hammer. She said, I lived with the stigma of a father who to most people was a monster, and this was the symbol of that monstrosity. And as soon as he was gone, I just wanted rid of it, and she destroyed it. So, yeah. So you can understand it, but also it's a terrible day for history, that kind of thing, really.
Yeah. Man, I've told you before, I'm so jealous of you that you had the opportunity to meet and interview so many World War I veterans. So my first year of college was in the fall of 1998, and well, it would have been on exactly this day. They had a Veterans Day assembly, and there was a World War I veteran who was in attendance, and he, I didn't talk to him, didn't get to meet him or anything like that. He's the only World War I veteran that I ever saw.
Wow.
And now I'm kind of starting to see that a little bit with the World War II veterans. I've had people reach out to me. Well, there's one in particular that I'm thinking of. I was an individual who saw some of the videos that I did where we took World War II veterans, back to the battlefield. And he asked, how is there any way for me to meet I've never met a World War II veteran, and I would just like to shake their hand. And that made me realize, I was like, holy crud, it's almost there. We're getting to that point, like what we were in the late 90s, maybe early 2000s with the World War I generation, where they're almost gone. So hearing you tell your stories on the podcast about all of these guys that you met and kind of handing their stories down, I just love hearing those stories.
I was very lucky, and I mean, some were kind of better than others in terms of what they had to say. Some men had very short wars. They went over and they were sick or wounded pretty quickly, and then never recovered from that, and then didn't go back to the Western Front, although they might have stayed in the army on kind of home service for a big chunk of the war. But others had very long wars and had been in positions where they could gather a lot more information about what was happening around them than the average guy in a rifle platoon, for example. So one Harry Coates was gassed at the Battle of Loos, and there was a group of them that became my kind of best friends and best veterans, if that's the right term for them,
Mhm.
who I used to go and see again and again. And Harry was kind of one of those. And he'd been gassed, and he was sent back too early after being gassed. He wasn't fit enough, really. He was still coughing and in a right state. And his commanding officer said, I don't know why they've sent you back here. He said, you shouldn't be here. He said, but he said, tell me, Coates. He said, because they never called each other by their Christian names in those days. It was always a surname. He said, tell me, Coates. He said, didn't you do the Pitman shorthand and typing course before the war? And Harry said to him, yeah. He said, I did. He said, in which case they need someone like that at brigade headquarters. Off you go. And off he went, and he became a staff sergeant on brigade headquarters, which put him in this position to see what his division, the London division, did for the rest of the war. I mean, you just did a film about the London lads at
Yeah, I was getting ready to say, yeah.
Neuve Vitas on the first day of the Battle of Arras. Harry was there with the brigadier watching those attacks go in. So,
oh, wow.
Yeah, so you kind of guys like that. And then I found this nursing home in Worthing called Gifford House, which was run by ex-military nurses. And once I realised that, I thought, right, I'm just going to act as if they're still serving, give them that politeness and respect of rank, call them ma'am, and see where it gets me. And it got me exactly where I wanted to be, which was in front of all these veterans. So I went there and I said to the sister in charge, who should I go and speak to first? And she pointed me to this guy. She said he fought everywhere. So I went and spoke to this guy, and he had fought he'd served in quite a few places with a London regiment, but it became clear that he wasn't a very proficient soldier. And he'd been transferred from battalion to battalion to battalion. Every time they'd moved around, they had a surplus of guys they wanted to get rid of, and they'd heard that the neighbouring battalion needed another 20, 30 riflemen. So they sent him off to that one, and then they realised they'd been served up, something that wasn't particularly good. And then their first opportunity, they got rid of him to the next battalion. So anyway, he had a few stories to tell. He was a nice guy. And I went back to her, I said, right, that's the one that you said I should go and see. So I said, who shouldn't I go and speak to? And she said, oh, Mr. Butler over there, miserable old so-and-so. She used the word worse than that, actually. So I went to see Mr. Butler, George Butler, and he was one of the most incredible guys that I ever spoke to.
Oh, wow.
He left home and lived on the streets of Manchester in Northern England when he was 12 years old for a year. And then he joined the regular army as a boy soldier. And when the war broke out, he was only 16, but he was now a private soldier in the kind of auspices of how the army treated young soldiers before the war. Trained machine gunner, should have gone overseas in August 14, but his battalion commander did the decent thing and kept the young soldiers back. But he was sent over in 1915 eventually with the Lancashire Fusiliers, and then he joined the machine gun corps. And we jump on to the eve of the Battle of the Somme, and I've got a photograph of him in his machine gun section. And he is the longest serving soldier in this photograph. He's the most senior soldier in this photograph, the smartest soldier in this photograph, but also the youngest soldier in the photograph. He's 18 as a sergeant in charge of a machine gun section.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, so he went over the top again and again and again on the Somme twice. First out of Battle of Arras, he was over near Fampoux, and then he served at Ypres and Cambrai and, all these other kind of places until he was wounded really badly in the head in April 1918. But he had almost, I would describe it, almost total recall of his war service. And it to such an extent that he'd be talking to me and he would pause and he'd look up at me and he'd see a guy, then I was in my 20s, he'd look at a guy in front of him who in his mind was the same age as him during the First World War, and he'd say to me, "Where did you serve? What part of the line were you in?"
Wow.
And I'd say, "George, it's 1986, mate. I'm not back in the trenches with you. We're here." And then he'd kind of come to a bit, and that's what it would be like. So it was it was quite an experience sometimes with these guys, and I feel blessed really that they passed on so much of what they did.
In my experience with the World War II veterans, I've found that if you demonstrate that you not only have interest, but that you actually know a little bit, that kind of helps them to open up a little bit more.
Yeah.
So for example, one that I'm thinking of, he's a guy that I became very, very close to. And he almost became like a second grandfather to me after my grandfather passed away. But his family knew a little bit about his service. And there was one evening, I was sitting there talking to him, and he would every time I went over to his house, he would have a few new stories that he would tell. And I'd be like, "Well, you never told me this before." He's like, "Well, you didn't ask." But his daughter was there, and I was asking him a few questions, and he said something about being in a fox. Oh, I know what it was. I asked him what they did during the Battle of the Bulge when there was bullets flying around everywhere. I said, what did you do if you have to go to the bathroom in your foxhole, because you don't want to get out, obviously. So his daughter, lovely lady, said, what's a foxhole? Is that like something that like a fox lives in? And he just kind of looked at her like, what?
Yeah.
And but if you do a little bit of research or know a little bit ahead of time, and there's so many that I talked to that I wish I would have known more prior to talking to them. But I noticed that helped to open up a little bit as well.
No, you're spot on, actually. The fact that you just made me think of a chap called Ron Shaw, who joined the 11th Royal Sussex in 1914 as a private soldier, and later became an officer in a 2nd Battalion Queen's Regiment, which was a regular battalion. And we were talking about something, and he used the word sanger, which is it's still very much used in the British Army today. It's a word that goes back to the experience of the British Army on the northwest frontier, where they would construct positions out on the battlefield out of sandbags, and in the case of the First World War, wobbly tin and stuff like that. And his daughter said, "What do you want about, father? What's a sanger?" And he just looked at me and said, "Stupid fool. Go outside," he said, "and wait until we're finished." And he kind of bid his daughter out the door, and that was it. We got down to talking about the war. So
oh gosh.
yeah. And a lot of them said to me they struggled to really tell this stuff to their own family. But this stranger comes along who they get to know and trust a bit, and they talk about it. And I like to think it was not quite counseling, but certainly cathartic for them to kind of sit there and talk about these things, because there was a lot of kind of troubled memories in all of this from many of them, if not all of them, really. I mean, one Albert Chester's, when I went to see him the second time, I said, "How you doing, Albert? How you been?" He said, "I fought the Battle of the Somme in my bed again last night." And it's kind of a very simple statement, but within it is just so much, really. So it's quite something, really. And
Reed Stevens, guy who was in the 7th Armored Division, Battle of the Bulge. He was captured and was held prisoner for the duration of the war. There was one time I asked him, I said, do you still dream about it? And he goes, "All the time." He said, "I was up middle of the night last night." He said, "I had another bad one." A lot of that stuff never left him. What do you think, after talking to all of these veterans and all the time that you've spent on the front, what do you think is the biggest misconception that people have about the First World War?
Well, I think in terms of the individual soldiers, people kind of think that they were tiny little kind of cogs in a big wheel, and that they had no kind of say in what they did, and that they hated it and couldn't wait to leave. And if they weren't waiting to leave, they were writing bitter war poetry about it, or this kind of stuff. Without exception, every single one of those veterans I interviewed all said, without me asking them, that it was the best moment of their lives, and they never would have missed it for anything. And many of them missed it, to their dying day. They missed that comradeship and everything that the First World War experience and the First World War gave them. And we tend to think of the First World War being this kind of full-on conflict all the time, but there were long periods of boredom in these trenches, where, particularly if you were in the support or reserve line, so you're not facing the enemy, you're sitting there and you're playing cards and you're writing letters home and you're talking to your mates and getting lice out your tunic and all the other things that you're doing, as well as whatever the army wants you to do in terms of maintenance and labouring and all this kind of stuff. And these guys were proud of their service, proud of what they'd done, proud of the army that they'd served in, and proud of what they saw as their achievements, particularly those who fought in the kind of final campaigns on the Western Front that did lead to victory. And I think the sense of what that victory was on the Western Front in 1918 is difficult for modern audiences to understand in the context of the scale of losses. I mean, all your films rightly show the scale of these cemeteries and memorials. And I think sometimes that can dwarf the fact, and maybe it's something we no longer accept, which is the consequences of conflict, which are casualties. And that still has very kind of pertinent modern resonance now as we look at the modern world and how politicians view the price of war, both for the country that is at war and the countries that are on the fringes of that war. So I think in that respect, the First World War brought about world societal change in how people viewed the value of sacrifice in a conflict, and there had to be a goal that was worth it. And I think you've visited Second World War battlefields and spoken to veterans of that war. Most people in the street would say that the World War II was a just war because we're fighting the might of terrible fascism or imperial Japanese fascism in the case of the war in the Pacific. So it's the kind of the sense of there being a clear baddie in the First World War has been lost over time. But Kaiser Wilhelm and the Germans were as much a threat to British interests, French interests, and many other European interests as Hitler was in 1939. And I think that's been forgotten.
Didn't exactly conduct themselves honorably when they went through Belgium.
No.
You can read some of the accounts of what happened to the Belgians as the Germans were marching through. I mean, it was pretty awful. You mentioned the cemeteries. So speaking strictly from an American perspective, that's one of the big, I'm trying to think of the right way to put it, one of the values that I found in visiting the British and Commonwealth sections of the Western Front is going to the cemeteries, because it's a completely different experience. Like the Americans all have big collection cemeteries. So you go to like Normandy or some of the others, and it's pretty overwhelming seeing all of the cemeteries, all the graves, all there in one spot. Going to the Western Front is different because it seems like countless just little Commonwealth war cemeteries, and you can stand at one and look and see two others in the distance, and like they're at Neuville St. Vos, or they're just east of Arras at London Cemetery. You're like standing in the trench line. And to me, I don't know. There's a certain amount of value in going through and looking and seeing the regiment that they were in, and then looking out in the field and being like, okay, this guy lost his life within sight of where he now lays.
Yeah. I mean, as you know from my podcast, kind of landscape is really important to me. I think that the whole idea of the importance of landscape in our understanding of the First World War, both kind of in a contemporary setting as to how landscape on a battlefield affected the outcome of that battlefield, through to the meaning of landscape today, when, like you say, you go to a place like Arras and there's these cemeteries scattered around it. I mean, around Arras, there's got to be at least 200 just in kind of 15-20 kilometer kind of circle of the city center. Many of those battlefield cemeteries, like you say, built on trench systems or shell holes where men were buried, and very personal cemeteries where you've got men from a particular action, particular formation, like a division or brigade, or even one battalion may be buried there, which kind of, they're beacons on that landscape, the cemeteries, for a reason. They're not there by accident. They're there because something happened there, a battle, or it was the site of a medical post, or it was a place where post-war large numbers of soldiers' remains were found and then brought in to be reburied. And each one has its own story, and the naming of the cemeteries is also kind of a fascinating subject in its own right. They're named after trenches, they're named after real people in some cases. They're named after mine craters. They're named after positions on the battlefield, and it kind of goes on. And the stories that weave through all of those war cemeteries, which are like time capsules, really, I think is what makes them absolutely fascinating places to go to, where you can really connect with the history of the First World War.
Yeah, it's once I get into it, man, like I've become consumed with wanting to learn more about it. And I'll have some people sometimes will, in general, maybe have a little bit more of an interest in World War II over World War One. I've made the argument that in order to fully understand and appreciate World War II, you really need to know the First World War. So, I mean, what would kind of be your response to somebody who says, "Yeah, I'm into World War II, but First World War not so much"?
Well, I mean, we met up at We Have Ways this summer, didn't we? And there's quite a few people there were going on about the First World War as being the wrong war, i.e., not the Second World War. I kind of think, I mean, certainly for me, those two massive conflicts have sat side by side in my life, all of my life, with a deep interest in the First World War. My dad was a gunner in the Second World War. He fought at Anzio. He was in Mark Clark's Fifth Army there, and then he ended up in the 4th Indian Division up at Rimini, and in the final battles on the River Po. So I've kind of had an interest in both of them, and increasingly over the years, like you say, you can't really understand one without the other, and so much of those two great conflicts kind of comes together, particularly on some of these battlefields. I mean, I've done podcast episodes about where World War One meets World War Two, where there was fighting on some of the same ground, and men who survived the Great War ended up being killed close to places where they'd fought in 1418 in 1940. There's a cemetery near Ypres like that, for example.
Oh, wow.
And I think that I mean, I go to Monte Cassino quite a lot, and the conditions there in front of the monastery on a place called Snake's Head Ridge was almost identical to the Great War, where they were dug in sangers in this case, and there they had to use old jam tins to go to the toilet in. They'd urinate in them during the course of the day and tip it over the side, because otherwise, if you pop your head up above one of these things, the German Fallschirmjäger opposite are going to start opening up on you in the daylight hours. And then at night, you could get out and stretch and so on. But I went up there with veterans, and the way they described it, it was like hearing a Great War veteran that I'd interviewed, decades before, describing trench relief in the First World War on the Somme or at Passchendaele or kind of whatever it was. So there's so many parallels, really, and I think that to try and ignore one at the expense of another, it doesn't make any kind of sense to me, really, because there's such pivotal moments in the 20th century. I mean, there's a British historian called A.J.P. Taylor, long dead now, but when I was a kid, he often used to be on television, and he would stand up and talk without any notes for like as long as you like. And a man I heard speak live many times, greatly admired him, and I didn't always agree with everything he said, but for him, he said, for example, and I think this is something I've mentioned in the podcast, is that the 20th century for him did not start on the 1st of January 1900. It started on the 1st of July 1916, the first day of the Battle of the Somme, because that was the moment that the world moved into the full consequences of total war, industrial war, with capacity producing weapons and ammunition on an industrial scale, and then men being killed on a battlefield on an industrial scale as well. And that really kind of heralded in really much of the rest of the century, with total war on an even bigger scale between 1939 and 45, let alone once you start looking at the kind of the dark heart of that, which is the Holocaust, of course. So where industry is used by a nation to try and murder an entire group of people based on their religion. So I don't think you can really truly grasp either world war without having some kind of sense of both of them.
Well, yeah, completely agree. So you mentioned the podcast. I know we've talked before. The podcast was something that was kind of an outgrowth of being locked in during COVID. And I'm trying to I don't even know how I came across your podcast, to be quite honest with you. But for those who are unfamiliar with it, it is super fascinating. And I almost describe it almost as like a theater of the mind, where you're describing things that you're seeing. And sometimes I think you're just sitting in your office, and it's almost like you're playing the movie in your brain and then telling us. And it has been so valuable to me personally. One of the things I like to do, I'll listen to it in my car, but when I can, I'll try and sit at my computer and I'll get out Google Maps and I'll kind of follow along and kind of see the things that you're describing. Is there any rhyme or reason to the topics that you pick for your podcast, or is it just whatever strikes your fancy?
I wish I kind of planned it. You know, I wish I did, but it doesn't kind of work like that. Yeah, I mean, I kind of started it because I 10 years before, when podcasts kind of first started, I did some with Dan Snow and various people like that. And he'd
Okay.
say to me, "Come on, dude." He'd say, "You know, you got to do your own podcast. You got to do your own." And I thought, when am I ever going to get the chance to do that? So I did buy a microphone at one stage, and then my daughter got into singing and she stole it, and I never saw it again. You know, because she decided using it for her projects, and then COVID came along, and I thought, well, maybe this is it. So, you know, having worked in TV for a long time, I kind of knew a little bit about sound kit and things like that. So I
Mhm.
bought a pretty good microphone, and I already had GarageBand on my Mac. So I kind of thought, right, you know, I don't need to, if no one listens to this, it's not really costing me a lot of money. I can sit here, talk to myself, if nothing else. You know? So I sat down and recorded the first couple of episodes, and I was pleasantly surprised that there were, you know, still people interested in the First World War, and it kind of went from there really. And I do sit there, you know, wherever I've recorded it, except obviously on the ground, which I've done a few of those. But I do sit there, and I have a very visual memory, so I can, because I've walked that landscape of the First World War so many times, then I can sit there and literally visualize walking up these tracks, and then describe what you're seeing as you're going up them, you know. So unless they've knocked a few trees down in different places since I was last there, hopefully it's pretty accurate for people. But I kind of, what I wanted to get across to them was that this, I think, still had relevance, and
Mm.
that there was still stories to tell about the First World War, and that it shouldn't be forgotten, because a lot of those veterans really did. They used to say to me, "I don't know why you're interested in this. You know, when we're all gone, no one will ever remember the Great War." And I like to think that wherever they are, they might be looking down, and, you know, particularly during the centenary, and seeing how many people were engaged by it, that they kind of got that bit wrong. But post centenary, which is where we are now, it's important to keep this going. And also, when you've been doing it for a very long time, as I have, I felt this weight of responsibility, having all this knowledge and these stories that these guys had told me. They don't, none of it belongs to me, and
Yeah.
I've got to kind of put that out there. And how do I do it? And a podcast is quite a good way of doing it. So yeah, I mean, I try and, I mean, I've got a list of kind of things I think, oh, I must do a podcast on that or something like that. And then a question comes in, I think, oh, I'm just doing one today. And somebody asked about First World War collectibles. I thought, well, that'd probably be quite a good podcast on its own, talking about what you can kind of find and collect to do with the First World War, because that's something, again, that I've been doing ever since I was a kid, really. But it just kind of, I have to fit it in between a pretty full-on job, which is related, which is running battlefield tours,
Mhm.
and everything else, normal life as well. Some people seem to think that I don't sleep, but I do so much stuff. But you just got to be kind of organised in what you do, and be. I mean, I am eternally fascinated by it, and eternally. Um, Desperate, really, to kind of continue to find that journey, follow that journey. I think, because it's so important. And I've been to some of these places on the Western Front. Honestly, I don't know how many times, but I don't go there and think, oh, I've been here 200 times. I'm not going to look at it. I go there, and I like to look at it with eyes that are as fresh as the first day that I went there. And because that way, if you open yourself up to it in that way, you see things that you haven't seen before, and you come to conclusions about things that you haven't come to before, and you see layers of it, and there are so many layers of it as well that you haven't seen before, and I think that's really, really important.
So for those of you who are watching or listening, it was probably not last summer, but summer before last. So at some point, I reached out to Paul and asked if I could have maybe 15 minutes of his time to ask him a few questions, because I was getting stuff kind of in my head. You know, I was looking forward towards doing this. And I think we ended up talking for like an hour or something like that. But one thing that I appreciate is just how incredibly generous you are with the things that you've learned and the knowledge that you have. I know some people who really know a lot of stuff and have done a lot of research, but they kind of, it's almost like they are greedy with it, and they'll say, "Oh, I'm writing a book about it someday, so I'm not going to tell you anything." But you've been super generous with it, and like the fact that you've been there hundreds of times or thousands of times or whatever shows, because when we were talking, it was really quite impressive, because I was sitting there on Google Maps and you were like, yeah, okay, go to this intersection right here. And now when you go there, go about 100 yards, there's a pair of tennis shoes that have been thrown up over a telephone wire, and there's a lot with a white donkey on the left. Okay, if you go a little bit beyond that, I'm just like, holy cow, how does he know all this stuff?
Well, I mean, you know, I kind of lived in that landscape for over a decade as well. That kind of helped when I lived on the Somme, and you know, I spent every day there doing ordinary things. You know, you go drive down the Albert Bapaume Road to go and do shopping and stuff, and you drive past somewhere, and you'd look in that field, and I'd know what had happened there. I could almost picture the shape of the trench line there, and I'd connect it to veteran stories or books that I'd read. There's a little spot as you're coming down the Albert Bapaume Road, just beyond Pozieres Cemetery, where the road drops away to Overlers at about 2/3 of the way down Mash Valley. And there's a hangar on the corner of the junction there now, but that's where Charles Carrington, who wrote Subaltern's War, led his platoon up in July 1916 in the Royal Warwickshire Regiment. And you see things like that. So I guess that over time, and you're doing that every day, and you're thinking about that every day, and you're absorbing the power of that landscape every day, then it will kind of affect you. But you know, I think it's really important when you have a knowledge of a subject to share that knowledge, because on my journey, loads of people helped me over the years. Loads of people gave absolutely generously with information, loaned maps, pointed me in the direction of contacts or locations on the battlefields. And it would be a dishonor to what they did to not do the same thing. And you know, those veterans that I knew, I often describe them as my kind of conscience, really, and a lot of what I do is because of them, and I think of them when I present history. This has got to be right, because it's got to honor them and what they were and what they stood for. So sharing information is a really, really important part of that. I know plenty of people who believe that they own subjects, that they will not share the fruits of their research, and I can understand that on kind of one level, but it saddens me, because I kind of think, you know, we are not greater than this subject, and the men that I've known, I will never meet people like them again, and I will forever be humbled by them and be in their shadow, because of what they went through, what they experienced, and what that made them as men. And I think it's given, you know, personally, I'd like to think it's given me a lot of good lessons in life. Doing this subject, it's not all about just death and misery and terror and horror, and there's plenty of all of that in it, but I think there's a positive lesson. These guys went through some of the worst experiences that you and I could even vaguely imagine, but they came out the other side, and they lived decent lives, and they were decent with people, and I think that's really important.
Makes it kind of silly to complain when the Wi-Fi isn't working properly, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
So one of the things that I've really liked that you've added to the rotation in your podcast is the question and answer. Would it be all right if we peppered you with some questions here?
Sure. Yeah. Far
All right.
away.
So I'm going to have to scroll back and go back to the beginning here because there were some that popped up earlier. Let's see. Okay, here's one from Professor What. Do you know any good books about the World War I air war?
Well, Peter Hart, who was once the oral historian at the Imperial War Museum, so he interviewed a lot of the guys whose recordings are now part of their database.
Yes.
Has written a whole series of books on the First World War, and his book Aces Falling is a really good introduction to the war in the air in the First World War. It's all of Peter's books are the same, meticulously researched, well written, well presented, the kind of latest scholarship on it as well, but not in a kind of boring way, and highly recommended. I mean, there's loads of memoirs of guys that flew in the First World War, you know, from McCudden through to many of the others, and there's probably like a zillion books on Richtofen on the Red Baron, you know, from everything from who shot him down to who he shot down to, you know, everything else besides. But I would say Aces Falling is a really good starting point for that.
Okay. I've actually got a video coming up on this coming Sunday, I think, that's going to touch on the air war a little bit around Arras. So
Right.
a lot of people, me included, I focus heavily on the ground fighting. But yeah, during Arras, that was the men of the Royal Flying Corps called that Black April. But all right, here's another one.
Cool.
As someone who's traveled the Western Front extensively, ooh, it's a tough question here. What's your favorite World War I site, and can you recommend any hidden gems?
Well, I mean, I lived on the Somme for many years. That picture behind me on the wall there is Courcelette British Cemetery at sunset, which I took about a dozen years ago.
Oh, wow.
Those kind of places are the places that I always gravitate to. I was back on the Somme a few weeks ago, and I popped up that lane and kind of saw this kind of autumn's view of what it was like. And I've stood there, I mean, I don't know how many times, but I will always kind of go back. I don't really have a favorite place, but there are certain battlefields that draw me back, and I find really truly fascinating and never want to stop visiting them. And Verdun, I think, would certainly be at the kind of top of that list.
Yeah.
You know, I've walked every square inch of the Verdun battlefield, off the beaten track. Christina Holstein, who wrote the book Walking Verdun, I had the pleasure of walking that battlefield with her 20 odd years ago now, and she's always been really good at sharing her knowledge to places to go and visit. And there were so many occasions, unlike where you kind of walk the farmland of the Somme, for example, or around Arras, in those forests at Verdun. I remember walking to this place on the other side of the valley from Vaux, and it was in a kind of lager area of German troops where they'd been resting before they'd gone up the line, and walked into it and suddenly kind of looked around in the scrub, and there was mess tins and bottles and water bottles and shovels and stuff just everywhere, as if a unit had just kind of pulled out and just left all their junk behind.
Oh my gosh.
And that was quite something. I mean, you know, I don't believe in kind of taking stuff away like that. I left it. As hard as that is, as someone who does collect Great War material, I kind of thought Verdun, it's different. You know, it's a kind of different place. But the memory of it is probably more powerful than if I'd taken one of the objects away, to be quite honest with you. So Verdun, certainly. And I would say, if you're not going to go to a British battlefield of the Great War, but you want to go to the Western Front, Verdun should be the battlefield that you go to, because it's going to give you so much in terms of what's there and the stories, and again, it kind of gives you that insight into the scale of it. A hidden gem, now that's an interesting one. I mean, there are so many. I mean, there are so many that I could talk about, but they're in people's private homes, which I can't direct people to go and see. I mean, there's a cellar on the Somme, not one of the well-known cellars, but it's underneath this person's farm, and it was used by a number of field ambulances of the Royal Army Medical Corps, and it's got the old Picardy stone walls, which are absolutely covered in hundreds and hundreds of names of soldiers who were down there.
Oh, wow.
the First World War. There's that kind of stuff, and almost every church. I mean, one of the things I would say, a hidden gem: go to a village behind the lines on the Somme. So not where there was fighting, but a village that was in 5, 6, 10 miles of the front line area, where it was close to the battlefield, but actually not that close. So although some of its buildings would have been destroyed by heavy artillery, most of it remains, so that the buildings that were there during that period are still there. Barns that the men slept in, estaminets that they drank in, and churches. And virtually all of those churches in those villages behind the lines have British Commonwealth or whatever graffiti on them. So you can literally kind of reach out and you can touch soldiers' names and engravings from more than a century ago. And that really is kind of living history, I think.
Yeah. One of the episodes that I did at Vimy Ridge, we go to one of those churches and look at the carvings that those guys had.
Yeah, you went to Ablain Saint-Nazaire, I think, didn't you? Which is that kind of preserved church. And then you went to Equavre as well, I think, didn't you?
Equavre is the one.
Yeah.
Has some pretty ones.
It's staggering. It's absolutely staggering. And every year I kind of find a new one, not a new one, but I come across one that I haven't kind of seen before. And we were out at Recce a while ago looking for something else, and we saw one Commonwealth grave in a churchyard as we were driving down this hill, and a chapel there. So we got out to go and have a look at it. And the chapel was absolutely covered in names: Australians, Americans from 1918, and then Canadian and British soldiers. It was really quite something. And again, I guess that's all part of the kind of discovery, or the pleasure of discovery, when you travel these battlefields far and wide.
Yeah. Here, this isn't a question. This is a comment that History War Cinema left. Hitler fought at Bärenwald. Me, Rob, and Chris fought boredom waiting for JD. So yeah, the episode that I filmed there at the Bärenwald, those guys went with me, and everybody always talks about, oh man, JD, I would love to go with you one of these days. When you're traveling these places. These guys figured out, no, it's not that great. It's actually it's a little bit annoying, probably, because I spend so much time there.
Well, filming is not I mean, people used to say that when we were making TV programs. Oh, I'd love to do what you do. I'd love to come along with you. And then you try and explain to them how much hanging around there is and doing the same thing again and again and again. It's not very glamorous, really.
Before I forget, you mentioned Verdan. I've mentioned the podcast several times. Paul also has a YouTube channel that I would highly recommend. And it has recently done some content at Verdan that's really quite good.
Thank you. Yeah, I tend to film this stuff in the winter when I'm out on recce's or I'm out on my own, and then don't have any time to edit it until months and months later. So all that stuff dates from back in March. So so finally got around to doing it. Yeah. I mean, it's another way of kind of telling the story, really, which is good, really, the kind of visual side of it.
And also, while I'm thinking about it, I just highlighted the comment from History War Cinema on his channel right now. He's been, I guess, replaying some of the old BBC episodes on the Great War. So, so I would recommend people go and check that out. All right, here's another question. What makes you and Paul decide which battles and men to study? What leads you to them?
Well, I guess, in the past, I'd like to say I was kind of, I'm going to start with a chronological look at the First World War, but I kind of found myself, if I'd have drawn a map of my kind of mind route across the battlefields of the First World War, it would look like some kind of crazy person's artwork. So I think I was kind of led by good stories, and still am. I kind of can sniff out a good story, a new bit of research where there's something that you can tell a story with, and that's what kind of leads me down there. And I'm fascinated by uncovering new first-hand accounts, of which quite a lot come out. I mean, doing the podcast, I've had people send me accounts written by their relatives that have never been published, that they've kind of found in the loft after they died and things like this.
Wow.
And that really is quite something. And over the years, in junk shops, I bought, when I was living in Yorkshire, a friend of mine was running for for a local hospice, one of these kind of park run things, and they were selling some stuff online to raise money for this hospice, and it was an unpublished memoir of a First World War soldier from Sheffield.
Oh, wow.
So I went down there and I gave them way more money than they wanted. And they were like, "No, you can't give us." I said, "Look, just take it. You know, it's a donation for your hospice." I said, "This is kind of gold dust to me," and this is fantastic account of this guy who joined up as a Kitchener's volunteer and then transferred into the regular army towards the end of the war. Was awarded a military medal for his bravery. And I was obviously meant to have this thing, and it's kind of one of these with these journeys. I sometimes think that these stories and these places find us rather than we find them.
Yeah.
Because I bought this guy's memoirs, and then about a year later, his hip flask and dog tag turned up on eBay.
Oh my gosh.
Which I bought.
Wow.
So I kind of brought those things back together. So I kind of think that was a bit of a nod from him saying, "Yeah, I did want you to have this and want you to do something with it." And I've got a few like this, which at some point or other I'm going to kind of turn into, you know, like talking books or something for the podcast and do that as a kind of spin-off for it, really, because again, I don't want these things just sitting on my shelves over there. I kind of want these accounts to be out there for people.
Ah, that is remarkable. Another question. Have you been to Gallipoli or Salonika?
Yes, Salonika. Yeah, I have been.
Just proved how good I am at mispronouncing things.
Well, it's got so many names: Salonika, Salonique, Macedonia. You know, in another life, I was kind of in Bosnia for a little while, which is on the fringes of it. But yeah, I haven't really explored those battlefields properly. That's kind of on my list for next year, actually, to go to Salonika, to go to Lake Dorian and have a look. The Devil's Eye, a position there where the British were. I picked up a Salonika trench map, actually, the original one last year.
Oh.
And which shows the positions in that area. So I kind of thought, right, this is giving me a kind of heads up. I've got to get there and take this trench map and let's go and see what we can find, you know, that kind of thing. But Gallipoli, yeah, I've been there. I must have been to Gallipoli 40 or 50 times, I think, over the years. It's a fascinating battlefield. My grandfather was there. He was in the Royal Navy. He rode in the lads of the Lancashire Fusiliers into W Beach. My great uncle, my Uncle Dan, was shot through the elbow by a Turkish sniper in the Crithia vineyard there. And I had a distant great uncle who was killed in the fighting near Crithia. So it's a place that I've always been interested in. It's had a terrible forest fire this year, where it's a national park, so a big chunk of it burnt down in the summer.
Oh, wow.
But it's exposed kind of all these trenches and positions from the First World War, and it's just crazy just how much is still there, to be honest.
Holy cow.
Yeah,
that's a corner of the First World War that I literally know nothing about at all.
It's kind of a microcosm of the Western Front, you know, because they'd hoped to advance on Constantinople, as they called it then, Istanbul, but that was never going to happen. I mean, the whole thing was just a folly, really.
I shouldn't say I know nothing about it. I know very, very little. That's
And it's, I mean, there's fantastic first-hand accounts. I interviewed quite a few veterans who were there in the 80s and 90s, and it's a beautiful battlefield. It's very different to the Somme or Passchendaele or Verdun or, you know, Chemin des Dames or whatever. But it's a beauty tinged with the sadness of 1915 for both sides, because the Turks lost an absolutely staggering number of men there, and you see this quite visibly. There's a lot of human remains still on the surface there at Gallipoli. Yeah, which is, you know, can be quite disturbing to some people, as well as the kind of archaeological remains. There are those too, and we made a TV program there in, I think, about 2003 called Gallipoli: The First D-Day, where we looked at the kind of comparison between those two events, and the thing that linked them was Churchill, because Gallipoli was Churchill's folly, and D-Day was all kind of Churchill was the prime minister and all this kind of stuff. And we I interviewed a War Graves Commission gardener who was retired, and in the previous forest fire in the 80s, he'd found a lot of stuff in the roots, and he had kind of this massive tray of gear that he'd found, including a lot of the metal strips from the original graves, and he had a pocket watch, an officer's pocket watch, which was stopped at a particular time, and it was almost, you think, is that the moment that man's life ended?
Oh my
And he was
gosh.
looking at that as he was about to go over the top. So it's an amazing place, and I've done an episode, or in fact, a few episodes on Gallipoli for the podcast, but Salonika is on my hit list for next year. So watch this space.
Cool. So this is from Sandra VK History, which, by the way, the map animations that you've been seeing on the episodes that I've been doing, Sandra's the man behind those. He's been doing a really good job. It adds a lot to it. What's the best relic you found on the battlefield?
Well, that's a good question. I don't go looking for stuff. Again, I kind of think that the relics find you. And when I was living there, I'd not long kind of moved into the farm we had there, and there was a underneath the house that we had, there was an original cellar with a filled-in tunnel that went into the lane, the sunken lane at the back of the house there, which the Germans had used to come into the house, which had a view towards Pozieres, which was probably some kind of observation post in OP for them or something. And one day I kind of went round into this lane, and they'd been doing some work on the bank, and it collapsed. And I could see something kind of shiny coming out of there. So I rooted around with a bit of a stick, and it was the lid of an aluminium soap dish, beautifully engraved with soap in English across the top of it. And then when I knocked a bit of the mud off, the soap was still on the inside of the lid. And when I licked my finger and ran it across it and smelt it, it was this highly perfumed soap. So that was
Wow.
1995 or something like that. 80 years since the Great War, and there was a bit of perfumed soap still sticking out. And it's those kind of personal items that was carried by somebody and meant a lot to somebody. Was it that guy's mother or his girlfriend or his sister or his wife, whatever, has given that to him as a kind of keepsake to take with him onto the battlefields, and he's lost it. How has he lost it? Those kind of objects I like, that kind of make you think about ordinary soldiers. So I guess it's that. But I think the most precious thing that I've seen unearthed, because I've been lucky to be involved in quite a lot of archaeological projects on the battlefields, are the remains of soldiers from the Great War. I mean, that is an experience to see a soldier literally brought in from the cold, of being buried on an isolated battlefield for all those decades.
Wow.
Is quite something. And in 2001, I spent 8.5 hours in a field watching these guys excavate 2 Royal Welsh Fusiliers, and literally kind of painstakingly kind of peeling the landscape back. And there were these guys, and they were in the kind of zig and the zag of a trench like this, with one at the end of the trench with a loophole that had collapsed in on him and lying down on the bottom of the trench, and then the other guy behind him. And they were riddled with shrapnel. They'd been killed instantly by shrapnel. And the guy at the front was an older guy, and he was lying on his side. He had false teeth. He had a gas mask on. The remains of his gas mask were in place. The clip on his nose was exactly in the place where it would have been, when his nose was still present.
God.
These were skeletal remains, obviously. And he had a snuff box in his pocket, a Victorian snuff box. He had a little wallet with a silver franc for every year that he'd been in France, which then gave us a kind of date parameter for when these guys were killed. There was one for 1914, 15, and 16. So this has got to be kind of after that period. And then the guy behind him was much younger. He just had kind of basic stuff with him, nothing really personal on him. But there they were, kind of frozen in time. 2 men killed just prior to the Battle of Passchendaele in July 1917. And buried in a trench for nearly 80 years.
Wow. That is wild. All right, here's another one. And I don't have any frame of reference for this project. The main oh man, I'm going to hurt myself trying to pronounce that. What is that?
It's the Mandamassige. So the Mandamassige is the main in France is your hand. The position at Massige looks like, it's kind of like that. It looks like a hand. and it's got ridge lines that look like the fingers coming off of a hand.
Okay.
So it's a bit of high ground in the Champagne, east of Reims. And probably 15 years ago, a group there acquired the top of the hill where there were 2 mine craters, and they built a whole set of reconstructed First World War trenches using what's called experimental archaeology. So they use the same methodology to dig them, and they use the same materials to prop them up and build fire steps and loopholes and duck boards and kind of everything else. And I chanced to cross it a little bit before the Great War centenary, and it's an entire hillside bigger than a football pitch, full of trenches. It's just unreal. I've got a video on my channel where I do a kind of a walkthrough with it. And I mean, every time I go back, I kind of have to pinch myself that it's still there. There's no fence around it. There's no booth that you pay to go in. There's kind of nothing like that. It's just up there on this hillside.
Oh, that's brilliant.
And they've got really incredibly realistic looking trenches, and it's populated with original material, so original barbed wire pickets, original bits of barbed wire, helmets in there. There's a 77mm German field gun in a bunker in there, for example. So it's unreal. They've got a dressing station, they've got dugouts, they've got a Petit Mersien light railway kind of thing in there. It's just incredible. And what they're trying to do, this is the project that Andreas talks about there, is that they're trying to turn it into a proper museum. So they're trying to get status for it and raise money for it to put a fence around it and to put a museum site, because there was a collector in the village who had this staggering private collection of First World War stuff, and he died during COVID, and he gave it to them, the collection. He left it to them in his will, and they want to use it to kind of tell the story of the First World War up there. So that's an ongoing thing.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I've taken quite a few groups there over the years, and I really undersell it when we go there. Undersell it, and they get there and they just can't believe that there is this First World War landscape on the top of this hill. That the only thing that's missing is obviously the noise and the smell, but it looks like there should be soldiers in it. It's just unreal.
And you have a video on your YouTube channel about this?
Yeah.
Oh, I must have missed that one.
Yeah, exploring a World War I trench, I think it's called.
Okay. Yeah, I'll have to go back and take a look at that.
Yeah.
All right. So hang on, let me go back. Next question. We'll do just a few more of these.
Cool.
What do you think of the documentary filming these days on either First World War or Second World War? Has it changed for the better? Do you still get calls for your advice work on a particular subject? What do you think? Is the old stuff better than the new stuff, or?
I would say that it's changed a lot. And in the business we call it factual television. So it's in Britain, it's changed completely in the way it kind of produces stuff. It's very different. I mean, I was lucky to work for the BBC at kind of a high point of BBC history in a series that was called Time Watch. And the production values of that was very, very high. They would take on people like me to be advisors, and every 6 months they would people would kind of pitch ideas for subjects, and they would do a whole diverse kind of programming of different stories, not just about World War I and World War II, but all kinds of different things. And they opened it up to a lot of voices, including up and coming voices, and not always just academic voices as well, which I think is really, really important. I think now TV's changed. I mean, it costs a lot to make a television program, so they want people to watch it. You get a lot of this kind of experiential thing where people dress up and they put wading boots on, and they put webbing on, and they do this, and they build a tank, and whatever it is. And I'm sure, I mean, the viewing figures kind of say that some people want that, but I kind of feel sometimes that it's got a pretty low common denominator in terms of how they think, how the intelligence of the audience, that they think that the kind of intelligence of that audience has. And generally the stuff that I've seen in the last few years, from my view, has been not always the best. There's been some real kind of bright stars amongst it, but it's not always been the best. And I don't see that changing kind of anytime soon. And there's something that I'm not really involved in now. TV's kind of seen as a young person's game, and I'm an old contemptible now, so it's kind of not my thing really. The last I did, we have a series called Who Do You Think You Are, which I did first US series of that actually some years ago, which I've signed a contract, so I can't talk about it. But I've done quite a lot of the UK episodes, and the last one I did was in 2021, and I probably rightly so. It's time for other people to do that kind of stuff and kind of let them really. Those kind of programs are important, where they take famous people and visit battlefield locations, because people watch it because of the personality, and then that makes them hopefully think about their ancestors who were there as well.
Yeah.
But I think factual television generally is not in a good place in the UK, and because it's underfunded. The real experts that made it were all laid off by major channels, and most of them don't have, all the people that I kind of work with over the years, most of them are doing something different now, which is sad really, because all that program making knowledge is lost. And I'm lucky with my kind of podcast and YouTube stuff. My good friend John, who I work with for nearly 2 decades making programs, he's an ex-BBC producer. He's retired now, so he comes along and I get the benefit of his knowledge and experience so we end up pointing the camera in the right kind of way really. But I'm always hopeful. I kind of watch pretty much everything that comes on, because I think it's important to do that. I'm not snobby about it. I don't always like it, but it's not necessarily made for me really. But good luck to those involved in it. I just feel lucky, again, a bit like the veterans. I feel lucky that I was able to do what I did for so many years in TV, because of my kind of unique knowledge of battlefields. TV companies would just be forever knocking at my door to advise them about where they need to go and film and stuff. So I ended up, going all over the place, kind of doing that kind of stuff, which was great, really.
Do you think that YouTube is kind of filling in those gaps now?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, look at your channel. It's so important. I mean, these channels are out there, and I think I saw a post from Rob, History in Your Hand earlier, and the lad Sanders got a channel, I think, as well, isn't he?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, all of these channels are really, really important in telling different stories. History, I don't own this subject, and nor would I want to. And it's really important that lots of people put out lots of voices, and it's the same with YouTube channels and podcasts and books and everything else. And the more there is, the better, really. And I think that certainly something like YouTube has massively filled the gap for that kind of factual programming. And you see it with some channels with staggering kind of viewing figures, particularly for anything to do with the Third Reich, which is kind of central to some of these channels. But I think that they have a great importance, and with it, I think, comes a great responsibility to get it right. And I kind of sense that there is a pretty big gang of people that work together that want to get it right, and and you're certainly kind of one of those, and it's good to see that.
All right, cool. We've got one more that I'll run through here from History Explorer, also a really good YouTube channel. Do you do battlefield studies for British Army units?
I certainly have done, not just for British Army units. I've done them for American servicemen and also German servicemen as well over the years. Not so much now, but it's something we do. The company that I run battlefield tours for, we do quite a lot of stuff for the British Army, and they're different kind of battlefield tours. When they do a battlefield study, they want to have, rather than a battlefield guide as such, they want a battlefield historian to be there as a kind of on-tap historian to talk about the subject that the group is studying. The group themselves will then have done a lot of preparatory work and will normally give presentations on the ground. So we did something a while ago where we took an army group and looked at the attack on the Merville battery in Normandy on D-Day, which is a kind of classic parachute infantry assault on a static German position. And these guys, it's something that I think there's kind of an inherent kind of lesson that they teach at Sandhurst, where they have to build a model of the battery site out of their packed lunch. So they get the bunkers of their bottles of water, and they use, kind of whatever to kind of make the barbed wire around it and stuff like that. And they come up with different ways of how they would have assaulted this position and what they would have done to overcome the enemy and so on.
Interesting.
Yeah, and then as the historian, you're there to tell them what actually happened, what Colonel Otway did, what it was like, how many men that he did, what kind of weapon systems he had to do that. So I've done those kind of things, and they're very different, but they're very, very interesting as well. It gives a kind of different kind of perspective on the battlefields, because they are potentially kind of learning environments for the modern military in all kinds of different ways. Perhaps more so, obviously, the battles and battlefields of the Second World War than necessarily the first. And I know next year we've got quite a few groups where we've got a lot of people looking at logistics related stuff. They're looking at how D-Day was achieved, for example, from a logistics point of view, and then the campaign in Northwest Europe. So,
cool.
Yeah.
Interesting. All right, cool. Well, hey, we've been at it for over an hour now. So if you have any other...
When you asked to talk to me about Arras and you thought you were going to speak to me for 15 minutes, I'm telling you now, JG, there's no way anyone can talk to me about the Great War for just 15 minutes. It's not possible.
Oh, shoot. Well, I appreciate you carving out the time to come and chat with us, and you'll have to come back on sometime. Maybe we'll pick a specific topic to do a deep dive into.
Be my pleasure. Yeah. Thank you for having me on.
All right. Awesome. So, again, I highly recommend the Old Frontline podcast. If you are into listening to podcasts, it's so good, and just a wealth of information. And also Paul's YouTube channel, also the Old Frontline, is just so good. And if you haven't caught any of the episodes that we've done in this Battle of Arras series, go check that out. Had another one that came out just this morning. Got a few more, and then we are going to be shifting to Guadalcanal. So anyway, appreciate you all jumping on here today and chatting with us, and hope that you have a good Remembrance Day and Veterans Day.